Well, welcome, Ken.
Thank you very much, Nick.
It's good to have you here. And what I wanted to do was to explore across a number of the themes that we've touched today around the Digital Maturity Index, but actually relate that to some of the practical examples and stories of things that you've experienced, that you've built, that you've fought your way through in your time as a consultant and as a CIO at BP. So I think the first one was, when you look at measurement models, can you think of some examples, some of the different areas in your career where you've been able to use them successfully, or you've seen them be part of the successful outcome of a transformation?
Well, I'm still thinking about the model earlier on. What was it, the lions and the sheep and the mules? Because at some stage in my career, I had this sort of evangelical conversion to just thinking measurement models were, one of the most underestimated, one of the most powerful tools, and I still believe that. And that did shape part of my career, which we'll come on to. But I didn't start by suddenly recognizing the value of measurement models. What I started with was puzzling why, in projects I was involved with, I was seeing so many mules that clearly were struggling to deliver the business change, whatever the driver that they were interested in achieving. And I think we had in the panel session earlier on, it was Bradley or somebody mentioned that that's actually still the case today. 80% of most business change initiatives don't achieve what they set out to achieve. And I'm consciously using the word business transformation. It's like digital transformation. Yeah, I'm kind of careful about its use. And we'll come on to that as well too. But most business change projects don't deliver what they set out to deliver. So I need to give you a bit of context. Starting back in this, I started my career after graduating with a high-tech startup, which was a kind of an unusual thing to do in those days. And even though it was a while ago, I can genuinely say that we were very much on the ground floor of digitization. I mean, we were taking previously analog manufacturing processes in the oil and gas industry and in the manufacturing industry, and we were digitizing them. We were adding real-time acquisition of data in those processes, and we were presenting that to management, and we were presenting it to shop floor workers and operatives, so that it could radically change their performance. Brilliant ideas, probably well ahead of their time. And I remember sitting down and we had a chat about this in the company. We had developed this fantastic product. It was genuinely years ahead of its time. And we rolled it out to 3 factories that were roughly the same size, all owned by the same organization. And the deployment experience of that technology was completely different in each of those factories.
Geographically dispersed factories.
Geographically dispersed factories owned by the same parent company. We deployed this technology. The first factory that we deployed it in, which is the one that we did a lot of development work with, went incredibly smoothly. It was welcomed by all levels of staff. The shop floor workers could see the power of it. The back office functions could see how they could use this data, and the management were pleased with the way it went. The next factory was kind of indifferent. The third factory, we almost did industrial action. It was like here was a spy on every machine, and and they didn't trust it, and they didn't like it. And I think as a young startup company, we were all sort of smart technologists. It was kind of interesting. We had no access at all to what was going on there. And it wasn't until we delved into it a little bit more that we realized, which is pertinent to this story. And what it boiled down to is that the first factory actually had a structured way of saying, this is what we're wanting to achieve, and this is why we're doing it. It's a variant of the saying that we had earlier on, which is, if you don't measure something, you can't manage it.
Yeah.
And I've got a slightly different version of it, which I've held from the days of that project with a company which is now defunct. And that is, if you don't know exactly where you are and you don't know exactly where you're going, then you shouldn't be surprised that you can't bring people on the journey with you.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. So that first factory, the management team had done a great job. They had a pseudo framework. Their change was a success. The one that was the worst didn't have any of that at all. It was very draconian. The senior management very much like, although we think it's a great idea and we are convinced of it, it should be kind of obvious to everybody else. So just do it.
Yeah. Communication is key, isn't it?
So communication is key. And we'll probably revisit that theme again, but it intrigued me enough that although I was, a graduate engineer doing work that I loved, high-tech technology, it intrigued me enough that it caused my career to change direction. And I joined the company that's now Accenture. At the time it was Anderson Consulting. It might have even been Arthur Anderson. Because in conversations with them, I felt they had more access to what was separating the projects that were a success from the ones that weren't a success. What was interesting about that is that although I joined them in a high-tech role, I did get drafted into the formation of the strategy and change management practice, as it was then, by Terry Neal, who was one of the founders. And I think, even though it was probably in the early days of consulting companies doing change management, we did genuinely very good work. We still weren't getting the success rate that we wanted, and very often, with the benefit of hindsight, I think that's because we didn't do enough to put some sort of commonly understood and communicated measurement framework in place.
And was that sort of a common theme that it just kept coming back to the same thing? We didn't see.
So I'm speaking slightly with the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah.
If I went further with the benefit of hindsight, if the startup company I joined had itself a measurement framework of some sort, it could be Microsoft or a Google or whatever now, but we didn't. But I think that if there was a turning point, to come back to your original question, if there was a turning point, the head of the strategy management practice at the time was Keith Rubble. Keith left the corporate world of consulting and went to Oxford University to become an academic and set up the university's business faculties. I was having a chat with him and I raised this very question. And he said, well, that's interesting because they've been doing research in the concept of the Balanced Scorecard that Kaplan and Norton invented. I don't know if you're familiar with the Balanced Scorecard, but it's probably one of the more famous strategic or macro level measurement frameworks. I guess in this digital age, people don't do paper reprints anymore, but I'm pretty sure that the article on the Balanced Scorecard remains the most reprinted article ever in the Harvard Business Review, but that's besides the point. Keith was saying that some of the research he was doing with Oxford was about using the Balanced Scorecard, not perhaps as it had been originally intended, but as a tool for steering and guiding companies at a macro level or departments or teams at a sort of more micro level through the process of change. And I was so inspired by that I left Accenture and joined a company that Kaplan and Norton had set up called Renaissance, or Renaissance, depending on which side of the Atlantic you were on. And it was then I think I really started appreciating how powerful a measurement framework can be, and how even to this day they remain as a very underestimated tool in terms of what it can bring.
So looking at where you got to, and then the next leap for you, I think, from our conversations in the past was into BP, and you evolved through BP various roles to a CIO in the Middle East and leading these large organizations, some of which with very large budgets because of the things you had to build. How did you experience the measurement models in that space, and how did you use them to try and be successful?
I think before I became CIO for the Middle East and for the RU joint venture in Iraq, and I guess we probably will come onto that. I was one of the technology directors in BP's sort of fabled CTO team that had a remit to bring innovation. And again, I think a point from the previous panel session is, sometimes you have too much data and too much innovation. And I was, and this would probably, when I say this, it'll probably date to this exercise, it's going back a little bit, but I was charged with bringing wireless technology to BP. In fact, something that you yourself, I think our paths crossed back in those days. I was charged with bringing wireless technology because the then CIO had a gut feeling that wireless technology was going to be transformational to the way businesses would operate. He was absolutely right. He called, all those years ago, the fact that everybody would have Wi-Fi in their house, that it's a time when cell phones, were only used for making calls. He called the fact that cell phones would be used for data. And we put in a measurement framework there to get our arms around the myriad of different initiatives happening in an organization, the size of the BP. Literally hundreds of little points of light, each exploding in their own way what wireless technology might mean to them. And we put in place a measurement framework, which later became known as Game Changers. It was a game changer methodology, where we captured data about an emerging technology and we quantified it rather than just qualitative information. We quantified it, and we mapped it against where these technologies were likely to make an impact on the business.
Yeah. I mean, that gives you
and that structure, that prioritizing structure.
That gives you an insight into where the demand is, or where the vision of the demand is. But also, I guess it probably helps you understand how not to be just duplicating everything and spending enormous amounts of money again and again and again. And the central role of guidance, love, but maybe a bit of a stick alongside your carrot is, it's helpful in that.
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, I'm not a great fan of centralization. I'm sorry, my natural way is to be sort of very decentralized. But I think in that particular instance, yes, in order not to be wasteful, in order to have everybody's, as the Dutch say, have their noses pointing in the same direction, it was necessary to have a measurement framework. And again, as we heard in the panel session, it wasn't the existence of the measurement framework that was important. It wasn't even the fact that our focus in that instance was on wireless technology, but it was about having a model that said we need to consider business strategy, we need to consider organization, we need to think about how this technology will cause your business processes to innovate. We need to think about skills, we need to think about new jobs, and we need to think about unintended consequences of bringing this in. So the measurement framework then, as I've used it, I can give you other examples if you want, was really a vehicle for having powerful conversations with the management team to make sure that people were aligned, and it then became a vehicle for communicating why we wanted to do what we wanted to do.
Yeah, the outcomes is key, I think, isn't it? Being able to tie back from an outcome to how you've progressed towards that.
Yeah, it's helping you focus, and it's helping you prioritize on achieving change. Now, I mean, there is another element, and I'm going to refer back to the previous panel discussion. There's an idea that came out of that I really liked, which is that if you apply the same measurement framework to different businesses or different business units, you have a very powerful comparative tool. And I like the idea of applying a sort of maturity model to an entire supply chain, or part of a supply chain or a region. Yeah. I think that's quite a powerful idea as well too, because you're using it as a way of saying, well, they're ahead here, they're behind here, that informs your decisions.
And I think we've seen examples of that, and Halil touched on it earlier, that some customers, for example, are finding that the advanced parts of their organization are not necessarily the parts of the world geographically or culturally, economically, that you would expect to be more advanced. And that's things you can start to uncover, I think, when, particularly with a large organization that's operating in many territories, you compare some of these different parts of the organization, and you don't just perform a digital maturity index at the headquarters, you actually look at the division and the divisions. And I mean, it was, for example, what you did in BP Iraq would have been fundamentally different to what the guys were doing in Alaska and Prudhoe Bay. There were so many differences.
Yeah, but because the business context itself is a different level of maturity. But you alluded to something else that is interesting. I think there's a certain arrogance in Western businesses, be they European or US based in particular, which is that somehow or other we are more advanced or more mature than businesses elsewhere in the world. And that is absolutely not true. Yeah. And I know that when we've set out to measure innovation or capability to change, there are examples that everybody can learn from in just about anywhere in the world. In fact, it's a bit of a digression, but I was a judge in an innovation competition for a country in Africa, and it didn't get an awful lot of it. It didn't get the attention it deserved. But I looked through what they had achieved and what they'd done, and it was mind-blowing. They had a clean sheet of paper. They weren't burdened with legacy. They leapfrogged a lot of what maybe was happening in the North Sea or Alaska or the BP concept, but they leapfrogged what happened elsewhere, and they'd gone straight into a much more digital solution or a much more modern solution or a much more appropriate solution for the business challenge that they were facing.
Yeah, and if you're not burdened by legacy systems and legacy structures of a business, so it's a luxury that people can adopt.
Yeah, I guess it is. Well, yeah, so that brings us back to Iraq.
Yes, so tell me about what a digital maturity assessment meant in that context. And I mean, you had a lot of challenges there, from the remote location, the security, the blank canvas that had to be built up, the travel, the remote natures of teams. I mean, there was an enormous lot you had to bite off to get any chance of success in that scenario.
So I think that was one of the most rewarding roles I've had in my career. I had an absolutely fantastic team, regardless of where I found them in the world. And we had an enormous challenge, and the enormous challenge was basically to rebuild an organization that had been devastated post, the invasion of Iraq. They'd been starved of modern technology for years because of sanctions. There were no IT suppliers. There was no IT infrastructure. There was no telecoms in and out of the country. There wasn't even any telecoms locally where we were operating, and it was in the region about the size of Buckinghamshire in England, just to give you a sense of size and scale. And we had to stand up, a company that, and it was a joint venture with BP, but it's a company that, in terms of production, was about 2/3 of the size of upstream BP in itself. And we had to stand that company up in just a matter of 3 or 4 years. So the budgets were big, and the 250 million year budget I think I had, because we had a lot of stuff to build.
And you couldn't use cloud, right?
And we couldn't use cloud because we didn't have reliable comms in and out of the country. So we had a lot of very specific technical challenges to overcome at a more micro level, at a project level, at a team level, and just dealing with the challenges on the ground locally. But one of the things that inspired me and a lot of my colleagues was the sense that we were rebuilding something, we were giving something back to that country and the people of that country, and we were upskilling them. And maturity was actually one of the key outcomes. We wanted to build a mature IT organization, but an IT organization in that particular case that was a seamless and an integral part of the business as a whole.
Yeah.
So not something that sits aside and throws technology over the wall, but something that really sat at the table with all of the other teams and departments.
And was the model something that you used in your communications? I mean, you did well to negotiate your huge budget there, but to encourage them to give you such budget, was the maturity model something that helped as an evidential point?
So at a peer level and downwards, if I'm honest, we didn't really use it hugely, and it was useful to show snapshots of it.
Right.
I think in communication meetings and town halls. I think its real strength came in giving confidence to the executive team and to the government of Iraq that we could measure exactly where we were at.
Yes.
And we could make informed decisions about realistically where we could be.
Yes.
And what investment would be required to get from here to there. And again, I think that the point that's been made by a couple of people so far this afternoon, it's often a mistaken belief that if you've got a maturity model and you're scoring from 0 or 1 to 5, the aim is to get 5 in everything. Yeah. The aim is not to get 5 in everything, because you'll be boiling the ocean to do that.
It's about being fit for your purpose.
It's got to be fit for purpose. It's about prioritizing, and it's about realizing that sometimes to get from this level to that level is genuinely going to take you 4 or 5 or 6 years or 7 years, because you can only train people so quickly. Yes. You can only stand up local suppliers so quickly. So enormously useful to shape that whole change journey.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I mean, on that point, I guess, playing devil's advocate for a moment, right? So if you look at measurement models in general, is it just about the precision that you're getting of this measurement?
Well, glad you said you're being devil's advocate. I hope I'm not standing in anybody's toes here, but I don't think it's about the precision of the measurement at all. Sure, you've got to have a measurement that's an accurate reflection of where you're at. And the measurements are useful because it tells a story and it helps you tell a story. But at the risk of being a little bit controversial, I honestly think that a huge amount of the value you get from this stems from the conversations you have to even produce it or even want to do it in the first place.
So you mean that bringing business leaders together who don't have this type of conversation, perhaps?
Yeah, so I will wind the plot back a little bit, and I remember running as a consultant a workshop for a company called Euro Sales Finance. I believe they're still going strong, and they wanted a balanced scorecard. It doesn't matter if it was a balanced scorecard; it could have been any other type of model, and we had, unlike Digitopia's, quite punchy approach, we thought, well, we've got a couple of days. We'll get the management team together for a couple of days, and we penned out what we'd achieve over those 2 days. And the first hour and a half or 2 hours was supposed to be sketching out on a diagram, all right, management team, what is your overarching goal as a business? And what are the 3 or 4 things you've got to do well to achieve that? 10 hours later, we still hadn't quite agreed the words that were in that top bubble, and we were still arguing about the ones underneath. And I was probably beginning to get a little bit stressed about my timeline going out the window. And the CEO had probably sensed this, and he came across, he said, don't worry, this is the best day we've had as a management team and a leadership team since we found the company. He said, just to stop and think about why we're here and what we want to do is a springboard in itself to how we get there. And again, that's just one of these sort of seminal moments of my career that I'll never forget. Because he was right. I was worrying about keeping to schedule, And these guys were having the time of their lives because they were sitting down and discussing materially important things to themselves as a team and to their business and to their employees. And it was a really important first step in terms of coming up with a measurement.
And that maybe ties back to the session I gave earlier, talking about the journey, where you are on that journey. And you've got to get some of these basics right before you start running these maturity assessments to understand where you're really trying to get to. Because no point jumping on a plane anyway. You have to know where you're going.
Very good.
So if we look at the world now in this state of flux we've got with everything going on, from the CIO perspective, how do you see a digital maturity assessment helping the CIO be successful in a world of incredible uncertainty we see at the moment, with people not understanding their potential, whether their staff can even come into the office, the things you're trying to achieve? But how does that digital maturity assessment, the digital maturity index we produce at Digitopia, how does that fit into the toolkit of a CIO, do you think?
Can I give you two answers to that? So I think the first one, which maybe sounds a bit grandiose, is that if I was a CIO and I realized that having a digital maturity index would help the business's change journey, I would actually hope that it was adopted by whoever it is I'm reporting to, or the CEO, rather than it being a CIO's model. Because if it's a CIO's model, it kind of implies the CIO is responsible for the digital transformation. And I think, as we've also heard several times earlier, it's not. I think it's too easy to somehow think that throwing some technology magically at a problem is going to solve it. It is.
So why
digital's at the foundation of every successful business. And everybody, doesn't matter if they're HR or supply chain, finance, operations, whoever. They all need to be in the same room. They all need to understand that. So, bit grandiose, but that would be my primary answer. I would elevate the maturity model to that level. If it was me as a CIO and I had an agenda to bring about change, I wouldn't hesitate to use it. And I've given you examples where I have used it, simply because for a relatively small investment of your time, you're left with something that's actually quite powerful if you're prepared to use it. If you're just going to stick the measurements on the wall and you'll walk past them every day, that's probably not much use. But I think if you're prepared to use it, then you get some benefit from it.
So I've got just to finish off, I've got a couple of questions that have come through. I've got, and we're going to more coming through here.
Your eyesight's better than mine.
Yeah, I know. Excuse me, reaching across to the laptop. So one of the ones I took a note of that was put in was, in your experience, how much time and effort does a business and a management team have to put in place to justify getting the value out of the exercise like a digital maturity assessment? How much, and how do you measure that value of all that investment? People are saying sometimes perhaps they're thinking this is a very intensive process.
Well, I suppose at the end of the day, you're only going to get some value from it if it works for you.
Right.
And I've probably seen one or two attempts at using models that have failed, but I think that's probably due to an inadequate understanding and investment in time to be prepared to understand what it's about.
Maybe facilitation is one of the elements that helps on that journey.
So so I've not gone through the Digitopia process. I like the toolkit and the dashboard and the methodology enormously, but I've not been through the process. It doesn't sound hugely arduous to me. What was it, 6 3-hour workshops for an entity or something like that? If you're a CIO, if you can't save more time than that by using that model, you should be in the job. And so I should be sitting. We should swap roles. Maybe I should be the biz dev guy, but I think you should save more time by using a model like this than you spend it. So the idea of you having to spend time and effort to produce a model is always the wrong way of looking at it. It's like, by doing this work, how much time and effort can my team save, and how much more benefits can we achieve?
Yeah.
That's an entrepreneurial, that's an Elon Musk type of positive mindset. That's a mindset you've got to take. I think that's going to be the right answer.
And I think what you said is reflected in some of the points in the panel earlier, and also from the customer perspective we heard earlier as well. People see that there is a huge value, and it's about being able to leverage that across the business. So look, we're just slightly beyond time now, so I'll pause there on the questions. I think from the perspective of understanding how you've come across a range of measurement models and some of the challenges you've experienced, we've got some great examples there. So thank you very much, Ken. It's been a great experience
I've enjoyed the afternoon
to chat and hear some of your knowledge and opinions on this. And I think there's a great opportunity for people to learn from that.